Find Daniel chapter 1. If you're visiting and would like a copy of the books that we're using, it's primarily the text of Daniel without too many extra additives. Our goal is to look at Daniel specifically. If you'd like a copy of that, don't have a copy, if you'd raise your hand, we can make sure you get one at this point. Okay, very good. Daniel chapter 1. Last week, we started discussing the beginning of the story, having seen Daniel and the Israelites being taken captive to Babylon, into the land of Shinar, and seeing the work that is being done against the people of God, trying to educate them in the Babylonian or the Chaldean ways, trying to convert them and make them loyal subjects of the kingdom. And of course they take the best of Israel first. They want to use the brightest and the wisest. When we left off, Daniel had of course offered up a test to the steward of the eunuchs, and had said, test us for 10 days, let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then you can test our appearance. Just give us an opportunity to have our cleanliness maintained. We don't want to defile ourselves. And an observation was made after class that I'll bring to mind. We had some discussion over what was going to defile them about the food that the king would eat. That certainly there's concern over worship to idols, and the king might have offered those in sacrifice to the gods that would have made him so strong and able to conquer other kingdoms. But it was also that just in the way that they might prepare the food could be a danger to the Jewish cleanliness. Would they have used an animal fat like pig fat to cook their meats and their vegetables and their various ways of living that would have made the Jews unclean by the standard of the law? Okay? So whatever it was, they were trying to remain pure. And so at the end of the 10 days, of course, we see in verse 15, their appearance was better than any other, right? And so the steward took away the food, the wine, and gave them vegetables and water. So we'll pick up in, I believe we're picking up in 17, is that correct? Okay, just wanted to make sure. As for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Take a moment, feel free to mark up the text or note some questions you might have, and then we'll talk about that in just a moment once you gather your thoughts. What do you notice, or what questions do you have? If we could get the microphone to Michael there.
What year is this taking place?
What year is this taking place? Very good question, Michael. So back in chapter 1, we are told that it is the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim that the collection of the people from Israel is taken. We would date that, according to history and the overall narrative of the Bible, around 605 BC, okay? So 605 years before Christ, before the turn from the life of Christ. Let me get the wording right there. You'll notice, though, what's happening here. Earlier in chapter 1, we had that they were, in verse 5, that they were to be educated for 3 years. So when we get around to verse 17, and we see them presented before the king, 3 years from the time that they were brought into Babylon would be around 602 BC. 602, 603, depending on where you might place that. Good question, Michael. Thank you for bringing the timeline into scope. Okay, what else do we see, or what questions do we have? Okay, we'll go Lisa.
It starts right off by saying God gave these 4 men.
God gave them what?
Well, everything. Their knowledge, their abilities, it all came from God.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we see here that the text is clarifying it for us in verse 17, that the wisdom, the learning, the skill, and I think reading back into the previous section, the health that they saw after 10 days was a gift of God. This was God-given. This was not anything that Daniel did. This was not anything Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah had done. Good. Okay.
I was going to add, it was a gift from God for their salvation, because it did turn out that way.
Good, good. So we're seeing, even though it doesn't state the salvation, it shows that they were redeemed from, well, the potential that if they had not been better in presentation, appearance, and fatter in flesh, that they had submitted themselves to whatever judgment the eunuch's servant saw fit. And so they were delivered or saved from that pain or that suffering. Good. Excellent. Go ahead. We got, sorry, I'm not going to remember everyone's names this morning. My brain has been everywhere but here this week. I've been in a preacher's conference over in Claremont.
I have a question.
Hang with me.
Verse 18, at the end of time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, what end of time are they talking about?
I think that's going back to chapter 1 and verse 5, that when they were brought into captivity, the king had assigned them food, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So we see that same language, at the end of the time. Good question. So that puts us again around 602, 603 BC. Dave has a comment. We'll get the microphone back to him.
Yeah, back to the food.
Good.
I believe that it wouldn't have mattered what they ate except for the unclean food.
Right.
Now, they ate, we all know, we can read, that they ate vegetables. I used to be a vegetarian when I was young. I did not gain weight when I was eating vegetables. I had down. I should start eating them again. But anyhow, but the end result was the faith given to Daniel and his buddies. But more importantly, it showed the king. Because the king looked at them when they came in. They were bigger, fatter, better in shape than the people stuffing chunks of meat down their gullet.
Good.
And I think that in a nutshell, it shows God's intervention. And God wanted to prove to this guy who's in charge here with this, because there's no way they could have been, fatter than people eating fatty food.
Right. Well, and that points to something I think we mentioned, but I love that you're taking us back there, is we're seeing God do the impossible according to man's understanding and wisdom, right? What it was impossible with man is possible with God. And so what we're seeing here, and to I would say even exaggerate your point, because I think you're right on, Dave, is that in verse 1 chapter 1, verse 1, what happened before they were taken captive? They were besieged. They laid siege around the city. When you lay siege around the city, you start running out of food. So likely when they were brought into captivity, they were weaker than they normally were. And so then to take 10 days eating vegetables and water, which doesn't make you any fatter, they become greater in appearance than anyone else who was brought into captivity. Yeah, so good observation, Dave. Okay, so in verse 17 through 21, what else do we see here? Mark has a comment for us.
Just real quick on God giving them this thing. It's for me anyway, it's a wonderful sort of mystery and a mysterious way that God works. Some of these things had to be miraculous, as you just alluded to.
Right.
They saw things that only God would know. But in other ways, because I think their center was still God, they would be revealed things that only God could reveal to them, and I can't explain what that means, but it's the same thing for us. Very much the same way. We find Christ because we are God-centered, and we find out wonderful things about him and his world and all these things because God is our center.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be this miraculous thing to experience this in our own lives, I guess is my point.
And certainly they would have learned a lot about the culture of Babylon in 3 years. They would have learned a lot from those who were teaching them, right? But what I think the text is saying, as Mark is pointing out, is this God-centered faith allows them to have all knowledge and all wisdom, right? Learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Not just what the Babylonians were offering, but anything that would be available is made available to them. They gain all wisdom and insight. And that is, again, how? By the hand of God. There was no other way to explain it. Okay? Of course, Daniel gets an additional gift, doesn't he? So we have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They all get this wisdom and understanding. I think that's the foundation in which we see them in chapters 3 and chapter 6 being able to stand the tests that they're put through. Because they have wisdom and understanding to see what the end of the matter is. But Daniel gets that added insight into having all visions and dreams, which, if we're in Daniel, who else had visions and dreams and the ability to interpret earlier in the biblical narrative? Joseph. So in some ways, the author's helping us put into perspective, if they're being given a gift of visions and dreams, we might expect a similar trajectory to Joseph. Wasn't Joseph taken captive? Wasn't Joseph enslaved and had to rise in the ranks and had setbacks and had all sorts of problems? And in that way, Daniel is instantly being brought to the perspective of Joseph as well. Okay? What else do you notice here? Barry has a comment. Was that you as well, Tom? Okay, you can have it after Barry.
So Daniel's there a long time. He goes all the way through the 70 years and goes into Cyrus. According to chapter 10, he's there at least 3 years in Cyrus's reign. So he's there the whole time, and they're getting the benefits of his inspiration by God.
Good. In fact, if we were to go back to our chart that we had that shows all the chapters and kind of the dates roughly that were going on, we would remember, as Barry pointed out in chapter 10, that we are given a timeline that talks about Cyrus. Chapter 10, and in verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, right? So when we go out to the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, we have chapter 10 down here around 536 BC was the 3rd year of Cyrus. Here in chapter 1, we're told Daniel is sitting in the midst of the king in his court, being in the presence of the king till the 1st year of King Cyrus. So, roughly, what year would this be pointing to in chapter 1, verse 21? 539 or maybe 538, somewhere in that timeline. All right? So, do the math. Chapter 1, 605 BC. There we go. We'll get that one. Chapter 1, 605 BC to 638 or 39 BC. How long was Daniel serving in the courts of the kings? What did I say? Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Kay. Read the board. No, don't listen to what I'm saying. Okay? So from 605 to roughly 538 or 539, how long was Daniel in the king's courts, standing in the presence of the king? I'm hearing math. How long? Almost 70, 64 to 60, if I did that math right. 68, 69 years, yeah. So we see almost a 70-year period that Daniel is going to be serving. And beyond that, I mean, we see his story go beyond that.
That is the captivity.
Yeah.
He came in, beginning of the captivity, and he's all the way through the captivity.
Good.
Comes out the other side, and is still in the courts there with Cyrus.
Yeah,
for the rest of his
absolutely.
life.
And so what Barry just pointed out is what they're tipping us off to in Daniel chapter 1, right? The author's telling us we are seeing Daniel in this narrative alone from the beginning of captivity to the end of captivity, right? So this book is going to stretch the entirety of the 70 years of captivity under Babylonian rule. Cool, right? Okay. Tom, you had a thought before we got on that one?
Yeah. I was trying to remember. Okay. So it's interesting when it lists what God gave the 4 young men. The first thing that's listed, where it says gave them knowledge and skill in all literature. So the Hebrew word for literature is often associated with the Torah. So it's the scriptures, literature, not like fiction or what we would call literature. And I think that's interesting because it's evidence that God is preserving his word. And I kind of imagine that these 4 young men probably used that knowledge not just for their own, edification, but they spread it. They were teachers.
Yeah.
And I see this as evidence of how, despite whatever persecution or whatever struggles the community is facing, that God's word is always preserved.
Yeah. Well, and certainly the king saw the value of the knowledge they had gained. Because what does it say? How does he analyze the knowledge and understanding that they had up to now? It was 10 times better, not just than the average man, 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all the kingdom of Babylon. Now, Babylon comes to power through swooping up other nations and bringing their powerful people and wisdom and magistrates and all these people. And so, what is he saying? Of all the gathered wisdom that had been gathered by all the nations up to that point, Babylon being one of the strongest right now in history, Daniel and his 3 friends were 10 times more powerful in understanding and knowledge and wisdom than all of that. Now, Good. Nebuchadnezzar's not a fool. He sees what's happened, right? He's observing this and recognizing this. Now, do you remember?
He's able to test them and see how much smarter they are, but so he obviously had plenty of knowledge as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly Nebuchadnezzar was raised in his father's kingdom, probably watched his father reign, watched all these magistrates and all these people, and had been trained to be prepared to lead the kingdom. He was not a fool in terms of wisdom and understanding it by man's scale, right? He was knowledgeable. Mark?
Talked about very early on, this is some of the key verses that we see in this book is about the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
And we're watching it happen, not because they're preaching at him or yelling at him or telling him, you better do this or else. They're just exhibiting their faith, and that's all they're doing.
Good.
They're living their lives.
Absolutely. They are just exhibiting what they have been blessed with, and that makes a difference to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I want to bring us back to this idea of 10 times better. Do you remember, if you were here last week, we talked about the significance of 10 as an image in scriptures. 10 is a perfection of humanity, that you test humanity in tens. We see this in Luke as he tests the 10 lepers. He heals all 10, sends them on their way, and it's a test because only one comes back and praises the Lord for what he had done. And isn't that the truth of humanity? That if the gospel goes out to all nations and all tribes, that not everyone's going to listen. They might be blessed by what Jesus has done and what God does in the lives of the people, but not everyone is going to come back and praise him. Not everyone else is going to come back and bow down. Now, I don't think that's saying it's a 10% success rate. I think it's implicating that this is a small portion of all of humanity will come and bow down. Now, flip that. Daniel has asked them to test them for 10 days. And when you see the results, you see for yourself what's going on. And what happens? His assessment is, you are 10 times greater than all of humanity. You are the perfected perfection of humanity. I have seen nothing like this. Right? And so Daniel becomes this image of Christ in that he is the perfection of humanity. And because of that, he finds favor in the eyes of the king and stands in the courts of the kingdom for 70 years, roughly. Okay? Any other thoughts through this section? Any questions? Dave has something for us there, Tom.
Yeah, concerning the 10 times, it's... Can't hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
Concerning the 10 times, that coincides with God gave them special knowledge and skill. Yeah. And the thing is, they were immersed their whole time there. I keep pulling that away. Sorry.
That's okay.
In like the works of the prophets of Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and the thing about it, they were in Babylon. It's a significant point because today people get affected and influenced.
Yeah.
It's easier to go down that path.
Good.
So these guys, I commend them. They're heroes to us spiritually.
Absolutely.
You know, and God gave them that. He saw that in them, and it's a remarkable thing because that could not have been easy for them with all the astrology and the false gods and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have people like that today. I mean, not as profoundly as Daniel is, but I mean, we imagine being the Israelites that were taken captive along with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were watching these four stand in faith to God and be lifted up in what was going on, even in the midst of captivity. And that becomes a light to them of this is what we need to attain to as the people of God. We are in Babylon, but let's not become of Babylon, right? And so, good. Like that, Dave. All right, chapter 1. I told you, in Daniel, there's a lot of chiastic or chiastic structures. There's a lot of crisscrossing of narrative coming to a central point in the book, okay? We saw that in the overall structure, if you'll remember from here, that as we, there we go. As we saw chapter 2 and 7, the first and last of the central section, they both show dreams that are given. Chapter 3 and 6, they both show testings of God's people. Chapters 4 and 5, Nebuchadnezzar's pride is tested, Belshazzar's pride is tested. Both are cast down, but then the turning point of the book, you'll recall, was right here in the middle between these two, as Nebuchadnezzar finally goes, I need to submit to God. Right? The overall narrative is I need to submit to God. What is the chiastic structure of chapter 1? Let's build it real quick. Chapter 1. You can probably write this on any of the blank pages. We're going to probably have a number of these. So, but towards the back, if you want to use the applications page, there's a whole blank page there as well. So you can start creating this structure. But this is interesting. All right, so what happens first, just in common language? I don't need a full retelling. What's the first activity we see in chapter 1? What was that, Lisa? Yeah, the siege or the captivity of the Israelites being taken to Babylon, right? So we start with the Israelites being taken captive to Babylon. Chapter 1 and verses 1 and 2. Okay? In your own words, what happens next? Roughly verses 3 and 4. Find the best. The eunuchs are commanded to find the best and do what with them? And to train them, to educate them, right? So we have them, we have the eunuch is commanded to educate and find the best of the captives, verses 3 and 4. Okay? What happens in verses 5 through 7? What's taking place there? I know you're scribbling while I'm asking questions. What would you say, Aaron? Preparation, specifically through what? What's offered to them? Food and drink. Yeah. So Daniel and the friends and all the Israelites that were taken captive are assigned the king's food, is what I put. The king's food is assigned. Okay. And then what happens? I'm sorry? Yes, yeah, and that's the eunuch is commanded to educate the captives in verses 3 and 4. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly we're not just talking like I'm going to teach you how to perform magic. It is a full assimilation to the culture, language, food, knowledge, worship, I mean everything, right? So certainly that's involved in that. Good observation there. So after the king's food is assigned, what happens? Yeah, Daniel says, I refuse to defile myself in verse 8. And verse 9 tells us what happens as a result. Not quite the test yet, but favor. God gives favor to in the sight of the chief eunuch, right? Or God gives favor to Daniel, you might simply say. The chief eunuch then does what? Okay.
What does that entail when God gives favor like that? How does that go about? How does he go about doing that?
We aren't given insight here, but this is the favor is the same word that is used for grace in the New Testament. right? It's a paralleling of the idea, and in that sense, we can see that God, in the midst of being captive and oppression going all around, God gives favor or grace to Daniel to find relief, to find favor from the chief eunuch. Now, as we noted last week, when I get favor from someone, when I get favor, I expect to see the results that I want. But that's not what Daniel sees, is it? Daniel simply sees that his request is refused.
I just thought it was interesting that that favor was given to Daniel. It wasn't given to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which I think just put more of a responsibility on Daniel to lead the way, to make sure that he's the one calling for the ability to follow God and oppose some of the Babylonian
kind of like a mediator or someone, the single voice that's going to help declare God's faithfulness and God's design in this. So yeah, absolutely, it's given to Daniel alone, and that's not given to all of them. Mark?
Just to kind of add a little bit to what Barry was saying, when these guys are, again, they're God-centered, they're acting godly. That's what we are supposed to do. And Paul explains it in Galatians 5, what the gifts of the Holy Spirit are. It's all of these characteristics of what the Christian becomes. We become the gift of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
By the way we behave.
Yeah.
And against that, there is no law against it. You can't. There's nothing against that. What can you say bad about it?
How are you going to regulate someone being kind or compassionate or,
And this is the blessing that they're getting. This is the favor they're getting from people because they're not being double-tongued when they speak, or they're not lying or trying to, backbite or do all these different things. They're being godly men. What do you say against that?
Yeah. Although the eunuch doesn't say anything against it, he just doesn't support it, does he? He says, I'm afraid of my life. Are you asking me to go and tell the king you're refusing what he's offering you? Don't you know that'll be my head on the platter? And he doesn't give Daniel what he requests, even though it said God gave him favor. We talked about how he needed to have the wisdom how to use that favor. And so immediately following that, what does Daniel do? What happens after he's refused? He presents a test to the servant of the eunuch. Right? He goes to someone else who's right over him and says, hey, I've got an idea. Here's a test. Here's a test. So Daniel appeals to the eunuch's servant with a test you might add on there. Okay? And how does the servant react? He says, go for it. Let's try it. And so the eunuch's servant approves Daniel's request.
So you see the statement that the favor, that Daniel's going to have favor with this steward, and then the next few verses show how that favor is revealed and how it works.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to see that play out as you watch not only in chapter 1, but as you watch throughout the book. What does favor from God look like? And as we look ahead, it doesn't say that the trial goes away. Right? Their favor that they receive from the Lord throws them in the fire. Their favor from the Lord throws them in the lion's den. Right? This is a book that's revealing being in the good graces of the Lord and in finding favor in his eyes as Noah did. Doesn't mean you avoid the trial. Noah still had to go through a flood and the persecution and the ridicule for building this big boat. Okay? So the eunuch approves Daniel's request. And what's the result? This is where we picked up roughly about 15, verse 15. We said, they look better than anyone else, right? And so Daniel and his friends are healthier as seen by the servant. It is witnessed by the servant. He sees it. 10 times better, in fact, as it goes on to explain. Yeah, good. And so as a result, what happens? Okay, before that, verse 16, what happens? So they are told everyone's eating vegetables. So if everyone's eating vegetables, that means the king's food was taken away. Right? King's food is taken away, and they're given all the food that they had asked for to remain pure before the Lord. Okay? And then they're given all the wisdom and the knowledge. And so God gave them knowledge and wisdom during the period of education. Verses 17 through 21. And yet, in all of that, they're going to remain in Babylon for nearly 70 years. They don't get relief from captivity. Okay? Where is the turning point of this story according to the structure of the book? Can you find it? Where does the narrative flip-flop? Well, so in chapter 1 alone is where we're at. In chapter 1 alone, where does the narrative flip according to what we've just outlined in the book, in the chapter? Yeah, it's right here at the appeal, 11 through 13. Because you see, before it, the chief eunuch refuses Daniel's request, and immediately after it, the eunuch's servant approves it. Before that, God had given Daniel favor in the sight of the eunuch. Now, he's given favor, you might say, or has shown that Daniel and his friends are healthier because it's witnessed or is in the sight of the servant. We see the sight of the servants of the king seeing what God is doing. Okay? Again, before that, and this one gets a little, it's as a result of Daniel refusing to defile himself. Right? So that kind of verse 8 and 9 can kind of be muddled together a little bit to really see the vision of what's going on. But in verses 5 through 7, the king's food is assigned. Then it's removed in verse 16. The eunuch is commanded to educate the captives, but we find out that God is actually the one giving wisdom and knowledge during the education period. They're taken captive and they remain captive. Right? So with a little finessing, if you would line it out more in the way that you would lay it out for a chiastic structure, it would look something like this. Ooh, fancy. So, A is the Israelites taken captive. What we might call A prime, they remain captive in Babylon. And so we see, as Aaron pointed out, as you kind of walk the scale A, B, C, D, E, F here, Daniel's appeal to the eunuch servant becomes the central focus of the narrative. What is the author telling us? What do you take away when you realize that the point of this is not just to see God at work, not just to see the faith of Daniel? What will it take to make this change happen? Gary has something for us.
Well, a consistency and endurance of faith. We're saved by grace. He was saved by God's grace.
Yeah.
Through faith.
Yeah. He certainly, the narrative is very clear. God is the one creating the success, right? There's nothing else at play here. Other than God is willing to go abundantly above what the faith of Daniel, as Daniel is fervently seeking after him, consistently going in faith and trying to maintain his holiness before the Lord, right? His purity before the Lord. How else might you say that? Aaron has a way to interpret that.
Well, there are a lot of courses of action that one could take when being forced to do things that are not right.
Yeah.
I mean, you could pick up a sword, you could fight, you could raise an army. The lesson here is, Daniel appeals. He appeals to power, and he does it twice.
Yeah.
So, the first one failed. Then he tried again. But there's a lesson here for us in that when we're being asked to do something that violates the law of God, we need to find a way to stand up against that.
Make appeals. Come with solutions on how we can do that. You notice at first he just says, please don't make me defile myself. Don't make me eat the king's food. And the guy goes, I can't do that. Okay, come back a little more creative. Use the wisdom God's giving you, the favor he's giving you. How do I show them, give them an opportunity to see how God can work in my life? Well, I come with an appeal, something that says, okay, let's shorten the scope. I'm not asking for it permanently. I'm going to submit to your power. I'll understand that. But would you at least give me an opportunity to prove myself? Or more importantly, for God to prove himself to you? And he comes and says, 10 days. That's all I ask. 10 days. 10 days. At the end of that, if I've been a fool and my God does not support me, I submit myself to you. Right? It's not always going to look exactly like that, but he's pointing at, go continually until you find the favor. Isn't that what we studied in Luke chapter 18? What does the widow do? She goes continually to the unrighteous judge and appeals to him daily, and God says, or Jesus says, will the Son of Man find such faith when he returns? Are we going to take that first no and say, well, God didn't want it? If we see that the faithfulness God has called us to is to pursue him consistently, are we going to do that? Did you have something else, Aaron? Okay, you were holding it like you were ready. Did we have another comment somewhere? Go ahead, Jay.
I was just going to say, go back a little further, that they were in Israel. They were not faithful. And it was evident to Daniel and his friends, obviously, that God was upset with them and mad at them because they are promised that land. They have to suffer the consequences of that unfaithfulness. And now here's a chance for that realization to come effect where they need to learn from their mistakes.
Yeah, and not only that, but even when leaders that are supposed to be your spiritual leaders fail, right? That's the point. This opens up when Jehoiakim had failed miserably, basically. When he had turned the whole nation away from God, which is why they were being taken captive in the first place. In the midst of your whole kingdom that you put your hope in, that you had, if you see leaders here on this earth fail, are you going to maintain faith to continually seek after God, even when another kingdom who can grant you favor says no? Gary.
I have an idea. I feel like Daniel still would not have eaten the king's food, even if it hadn't turned out that way. It's kind of like the three guys when they were going to be thrown into the furnace. They said, God will save us, but if he doesn't save us from the fire, we're still not going to bow down.
Yeah. We don't know what would have happened next, but I think you're right, Gary. I think what we're seeing here is Daniel's faith was so steadfast in trusting in the Lord that whatever the outcome the servant would have seen, whatever outcome the servant would have offered, I don't think Daniel would have stopped pursuing the Lord. So how many roadblocks are we willing to endure through? How many trials are we willing to go through, even when we're being taken captive by the world? It's a powerful lesson, chapter 1. It's a call to a faith that truly endures. All right. We'll pick up in chapter 2 next week, as it is time to be done. We'll hear that bell in just a moment. Chapter 2 will open up with another timeline, of course. We'll get in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll pick up the story there. And we'll actually look at, if you have time and are interested, go look at when the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar was compared to the story we just saw. Okay? Interesting lineup there, and I think gives some insight as to what we're seeing happen. So, thank you.